Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the CSFL Kickoff show, and boy do we have an action-packed lineup for you today. We are going to be breaking down the JJ Watt trade, getting reaction to that blockbuster deal that happened this week. We're also going to be discussing tips on free agency and on general cap management, as well as our usual GM bites. It's going to be a great show, I'm looking forward to it, and thank you very much for joining in. Let's get straight to it. Well, it seems like every time we have one of these episodes, there's always a blockbuster trade to discuss, and this week it was no different. We saw probably the league's best defensive end in JJ Watt being traded from the Denver Broncos over to the Arizona Cardinals for the likes of Kevin Garth and Frank Alexander. And well, before I give you my reaction to the trade and give you my views, opinions on maybe who's won the trade, maybe who could win it in the long term, let's go straight to it and hear directly from both GMs about the reasons for why they made this transaction.
So I know a lot of you are probably wondering why the Cardinals brought in JJ Watt and his $15+ million a year contract. We're looking to take bigger steps in the right direction this season after we just missed the playoffs last season. The main catalyst for this move was his sack production. Last year, the defensive ends in Arizona had a combined 14 sacks. JJ Watt all by himself had 15 in Denver. So that's just doubling our sack production with one player. That's insane. So, he's going to slide into the starting role next to Okafor because we traded Alexander, who only had 3 sacks last year, but Okafor had 7. So our starting defensive ends will have a combined 22 sacks from a year ago. So, we're thrilled. We're excited. You can never have too much pressure on the quarterback. That the pressure is going to cause the quarterback to, make mistakes, make bad throws, make bad decisions, maybe even hold on to the ball a little bit longer because they're going to get gun shy, and, that'll just add more sack totals for us. So, we're excited. We're thrilled. We can't wait for the season to get here. We want to see what this dude can do out in the field for us. And hopefully we'll be able to ride him into the playoffs. That's the hope anyways.
Why did I trade JJ? So a lot of key things came into trading JJ. I entered the offseason and knew I was going to have either Lamar Houston or JJ Watt off the team. They were taking up a substantial part of my cap, and I had to have it come to heart that, yes, while having 2 elite defensive ends, it's going to be great for the team and all that, and make us a top-tier team, we were also lacking in other areas where I needed to go out and spend cap. And once I got out and started spending cap, getting trades, I realized how hard it is to build a complete team when 2 positions are not 2 positions, just one position is making over $25 million against your cap. So I traded Lamar Houston for nothing to get me back underneath the cap. Thought that I was going to be good there. And then a lot of good trade opportunities opened up for me to help expand the team and make us an offensive juggernaut, and JJ was collateral. And JJ, I didn't think he was going to get as much as I did for him. I knew he was not old, but he's not getting any younger. He's 29 years old. He's going to start regressing. And I just didn't think I was going to get GARTH or Frank Alexander, much less both for JJ, since they're both kind of younger. But I threw a Hail Mary of a trade offer. I ended up having to cut off like a fifth or something like that to get Parm to really like it. So I did that, and the end is history. And this move is helping me move on from D'Brickashaw Ferguson, who is also making $10 million against the cap and is 36 years old, so he will start regressing fairly soon. But yeah, so that's why I traded JJ.
Many thanks to Palm and Toasty there for their reaction to the trade for JJ Watt. So let's dive into a little bit and talk about what JJ Watt probably brings to the Cardinals, perception there, and then also in terms of what the Cardinals have given up back to the Denver Broncos and the reason behind sort of the transaction for both teams. In terms of JJ Watt, I mean, it's fair to say that he is probably the best defensive end in the league. He is, stats-wise, ratings-wise, he has always been phenomenal. He has speed, tackling, agility, strength. He can play, effectively in any type of system usually. I would say that the main driving force in terms of bringing JJ Watt to any team, as Palm rightly explained, is to bring that type of pressure defense that probably the Cardinals haven't ever had really. And so the opportunity to take on JJ Watt despite his largish contract is probably a gamble that's worth taking for a team that's borderline playoffs this year, possibly, given the good performances that the team had last year. I think a lot of the balance, though, from the Cardinals' perspective, comes down to how much of JJ Watt's production is based on system versus based on his ratings. And I think it's a really hard thing to try and call at the moment, because JJ Watt as a player has been under some great GMs that have been in the CSFL. Obviously, we all know about Noah, who was with the Denver Broncos, and he was probably one of the best defensive game planners that we have seen in the league since its formation. Obviously, Toasty has also had a great defensive setup in his history back with the Steelers, but there's a balancing act here between that type of system fit that he's been great in versus the ratings. And I mean, it's really interesting to say that he did have a really good season last year. 15 sacks, as Palm rightly justified, is an awesome performance. I think that maybe the Cardinals and Palm are expecting that type of performance again, and I question whether that is going to be possible this season. But it depends on the system setup. If they can get that type of value out of JJ Watt, hands down, this is a fantastic transaction for them, and it probably will give them a great chance of making the playoffs this year. On the other side of things, though, obviously Toasty taking us through his reasoning and feeling that JJ Watt combined with Houston probably wasn't the right type of cap setup for that team going forward, and he rightly mentioned that he wants to try and turn Denver away from what has traditionally been a very good defensive team into an offensive powerhouse, was the quote that was used in that press conference. And I can understand the logic behind that. Interesting perception that he felt that he wasn't going to get any real value for JJ Watt. I'd probably argue that he would have got value regardless, just because JJ Watt is that good. And despite the contract, people would have probably made a move to try and get him similar to the Cardinals' position. But I feel that the return that they got on Watt is actually not too bad. I feel that picking up someone like Kevin GARTH, who has a couple of years left, is a pretty solid overall tackle. He's going to slot in there quite nicely and probably give them a nice little upgrade there. And also picking up Frank Alexander I mean, they're not going to be losing it too much with that deal. I mean, Alexander is still a very, very good defensive end. He's not on JJ Watt's level of performance, but he's still a pretty good defensive end. And again, if they can get the system fit going with him, then Alexander may have a very, very good season this year. He may have one of his best seasons that we've ever seen. So what do we take away from this, I guess? I mean, I think the thing to take away from both teams is they're both going about building their team in a slightly different manner. The Cardinals obviously feel that they need that type of player to probably make that push into the playoffs. And on the face of it, they haven't given up a great deal. They've given up 2 starter quality players probably for most teams. But to try and land a star like Watt for a couple of seasons, see if it works, see if they can manage that contract, is a good opportunity for them. So I can see why that makes sense. On the Broncos side, the move to readjust some of the cap positions, they've obviously had a very busy offseason bringing guys in. Still probably more transactions for Toasty to do, I imagine, through the rest of the offseason. But that restructuring has meant that JJ Watt's contract is basically unviable for them. And so the question mark really becomes, if JJ Watt has enough still in the tank and ability-wise and fits the Cardinal system and he goes in there, then it's a great fit for them and they will hands down win this trade. However, if he goes in there and he puts up similar types of numbers to the likes of Alexander, it's middling numbers, it's not great, it's a couple of sacks, it's nothing really too special, then they're going to lose the trade because they'll have basically given up two viable players for one star player who has underperformed. But it's a great opportunity to try and show how, in this league, you can build a team through any type of style, any type of contract situation. And, you can take on big stars and roll the dice with them and see if that's enough. But also you can build a more balanced roster and see if that is deep enough to maybe land you in the playoffs. I think it's fair to say that my expectation for the Broncos and Toasty is probably going to be higher than the Cardinals and Palm this year, just because of the GM history there. Palm is still fairly new into the league, but he's definitely learning a huge amount every single season. But the Broncos historically have been a contender, and that's kind of where I expect them to end up regardless of this move. So, I mean, we'll probably come back to this one later down the line. I'm sure it'll be one of the discussions through the season, along with some of the other blockbusters that we've seen this off-season. But I think on balance, I like the deal for both teams. It makes sense, it's viable for both, and I can see the logic behind doing it. So we'll see how that plays out through the rest of the season. But now it is time for us to dive across and talk a little bit about free agency and about tips and things in terms of managing cap, because similar to the JJ Watt deal, you can have large contracts and you do have to manage a cap situation, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and a little bit about tips for free agency. So let's dive into this then and talk a little bit about cap setup first. And I think the best way to try and talk about this really is to give you guys some tips based on some real life teams that are having cap challenges at this moment in time. And I think probably the prime example of that is probably going to be someone like the Kansas City Chiefs, a team that is over the cap situation at the moment. Running through that, and they've had the draft, they've got players with high contracts, players with medium contracts, and just talk through some of the approaches you can take to try and manage cap situation, because I'm sure for the new GMs that's going to be one of the things that is right on their mind at the moment, trying to manage that and get themselves down to that $150 million hard cap limit that we have in the league. And I've been talking through this with a couple of new GMs really, and who've taken on teams who are over the cap, and there's the immediate panic of, oh my goodness me, we're over the cap, we've got to just try and sell some contracts around everywhere and just try and dump contracts. And whilst that is one approach, panicking like that is probably not the best way to do this. And let's just talk through a couple of things that you can do in the context of Kansas City, for example. So Kansas City Chiefs, currently $3 million over the hard cap at the moment. Now, obviously, as I said, you can just try and trade away a couple of million, a few million, and make it kind of fit. And there's a couple of things you can do that are a little bit more dynamic, in the sense that veteran GMs will be aware of this, but I think it's worth just sharing with the wider audience what you can do in these situations. So, assuming you are over the cap, you've got a couple of options. you can obviously try and trade based on the contract value of the individual that you need to move and piece it up and do that. And you have to probably end up paying some sort of asset to do that. Now, on the face of it, if you're only 3 million over, you could probably wind that through a couple of deals and a couple of transactions. But say you're 10, 11 mil over, and we've seen this in the past. Then there's an opportunity here that you can do a couple of things. One is you can still try and trade the contracts. But say, for example, the Chiefs here are, say, 10, 11 mil over the hard cap, for example, hypothetically. Now, one of the immediate things you can do is you can, try and sell contracts based on the cut value of them. So, for example, if we had to cut Sam Bradford, I mean, Kansas City will never cut Sam Bradford, that'd be crazy. But if they did have to cut a high value contract like Sam's, rather than trying to sell it to a team as the $17 million that they're going to have to take on, they're going to have to find the salary fit for that. And most teams are going to struggle to do that. Most teams are up against the hard cap limit, particularly at this time of the off-season. Now, a much easier sell and a much cheaper sell in that situation is to try and move Sam Bradford to a team based on his value that it would cost to cut him. So obviously we know in the CSFL that is 20% of their contract, each year of their contract. So for example, for Sam Bradford, it's about 3.5 million or so per season it would cost to cut it. Now, if this was a 1 year deal, you're only really having to find someone to take $3.5 million worth of just dead salary essentially, which is a much easier sell than trying to move the $17 million. So that's one way you could approach it. The other thing at this time of season, you'll see a lot of savvy veteran GMs do if they are up against the cap limit. Particularly if they've gone massively over or a few million over, and they don't necessarily want to lose any of the roster talent that they might have, is as you build up towards free agency period 9, which is the one before the final free agency period, you will see possibly teams in that situation cut players to then try and re-sign them in free agency 10 to a cheaper deal. So if we go back to Sam Bradford as the example here, I mean, assuming Sam Bradford is on a 1 year deal, what you could possibly do if you are over the hard cap by a considerable amount in this situation is you could cut Sam Bradford's contract on free agency 9, take the $3.5 million hit to his salary, assuming this is an expiring, not the 4 or 5 year deal that is here. Take that hit, and then what that does is it essentially frees up about $14 million worth of his salary to then obviously take a cut out of that to get yourself back within the hard cap limit. But then you could go and offer him just a 1 year deal for that remaining amount. So it could be a case of, you could maybe offer him, if you have 5 or 6 million over, you could possibly offer him like another $8 or $9 million contract and still get under the hard cap with that situation. And you will see a lot of savvy GMs, particularly the veteran ones who are over the cap limit, try and do that in free agency 9 and 10. So that's just a little tip for you guys. A couple of ways you can approach managing cap situation rather than panicking and trying to just dump the whole contract on someone. Thinking about that a little bit more dynamically through that period. And obviously the other great thing of that cut and sign opportunity on free agency 9 and 10 is if you cut them on free agency 9 and you don't sign them on free agency 10, there is of course a risk that someone else signs them and they spot it, and there are teams that will look at that in free agency 10 and have salary ready to just jump in if someone gets cut. Be aware of that will happen here. But the other thing is if nobody actually signs them in free agency 10, obviously it goes into the bidding period where you essentially claim players, and I think it's based on the worst rating of the power rankings from the current last season in game. But obviously if you are the last, the last team, there's an opportunity there for you to pick up someone very cheap, because the minimum salary obviously at that point is $175,000 for that year. So if you're the team at the bottom, be aware of that and keep an eye out of who's been cut in free agency 9 and maybe not signed in 10, because you can snag yourself a really cheap player there who could possibly be a real good asset for you going forward and help you improve your performance. Or it's a trade piece, $175,000 to a contending team for a player possibly who's a really good starter is a no-brainer for teams in sort of that week 5 or so, when the transaction period falls off for those restricted players. And we've seen that happen before. Couple of examples of that happen and really play out really well. So keep an eye out for that if you are the team that's maybe the worst ranked team from last season, because there's always an opportunity there for you to snag a couple of good players. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a perspective on cutting players and signing them and getting under hard caps and trading them, and really thinking a bit more outside the box rather than just the flat salary that the players have associated to them at that moment in time. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about tips for free agency, because again, conscious we've got a lot of new GMs, and free agency is one of these mind-boggling things in Draft Day Sports Pro Football, where what it says on the tin doesn't necessarily come back to how it sometimes plays out in the game and the logic. So bear with me, I'm going to you're going to see nothing appear here, but I'm going to just quickly log in with the Lions and talk you through how free agency works and kind of some approaches you can take to it, not just for this season, but for next off season as well. Okay, so we are back with the Detroit Lions. Logging in as for the free agency screen just so we can see it. And I'm just going to talk through a little bit about some things you consider when trying to make offers for free agents and how to try and approach it really. So obviously a lot of new GMs, when they come in, they jump in and they immediately look at a player and they go, okay, free agency, this is what he's asking for. Okay, he wants 7.3 million. I'm going to go in and just offer him $7.3 million and be done with it. Now, that's fine for some players where the value matches what their demands are. For example, if you're thinking about certain players in certain positions, there'll be some where the value kind of makes sense. If it's like a star player who's demanding, let's say, $7 million or something, and he's a tackle, that's a fair amount. But what we see with Draft Day Sports Pro Football is that despite us tweaking the contract balances between the ratings and positions and all those things that we do that's in the CBA, players' demands don't necessarily match their overall rating, and you need to think a bit more broader than just what the player's demanding in free agency. So if we take Matt Cleveland here, for example, he is currently the best overall player in this free agency period at this moment in time, free agency round 8. So he is demanding between $8 and $10 million. And some teams will probably dive in and go, yeah, it's an 87 overall. He's got okay strength. His run blocking's okay. He's bid $8 million. That is just probably quite an insane approach to take. If you did that for everyone, you would end up with no salary whatsoever. And we've seen new GMs come in and just really struggle with this and offer $20, $15, $20 million to a player, and then realise that with $150 million to play with in your salary, it quickly turns into a situation where you have 4 or 5 overpaid players and then 35 plus players who are completely useless because that's all you can afford. So how do you approach this? How do you approach this conundrum that Matt Cleveland is probably, he's probably an okay player. He's probably could start for most teams, and he's going to have some deficits on his pass blocking, so you need to balance that out. But he's an okay starter. How do you balance what realistically you should be offering a player like that? So hopefully I'll give you some tips of how to kind of approach that. The first thing I would always do is I would go into the Finances tab, and in here there's a salary analysis button, and if you click that, what this does is it gives you an immediate snapshot of who the highest paid player is by position and what the roughly average is for that position plus the average for the starters. So what you'll see here, if we look at Matt Cleveland's position, which is a centre, the average salary is 2.8 million, starters roughly 4.3, and the highest paid player is MAURKICE POUNCEY, who is a phenomenal centre. Guy's unbelievably good. So if you were thinking Matt Cleveland $8 million, that would make him twice the amount of what an average starter is in the league. probably not the best place to start in terms of offering him that amount. But you might think, Matt Cleveland, I need a starter. I'm happy to pay him a little bit above average, possibly, because I need that position. So how do you balance that off between what you have versus what you want to offer? Now, the other thing that I tend to do is I still do it now, is I go and look at some of the best teams in the league and look at how their salary structure works and use that as essentially a bit of a baseline for roughly what I think the salary feels like I should be offering for that player, depending on what I need. So obviously, if Matt Cleveland is a guy I think is going to start for me, then I might be thinking about a little bit more money than if, say, I have already got an elite centre and Matt Cleveland is probably not going to start for me. I would probably offer him a little bit less, for example. But, if you go into the Rams, so obviously they're paying BREWSTER about $5 million. So similar sort of player, I would say, to Matt Cleveland. Probably slightly better player, in my opinion. His strength is a bit better. He's similar in that his pass blocking is deficient to his run blocking. But, on the face of it, similar sort of player. So $5 million for what was the Super Bowl champions last year, the current champions. That's $5 million for that centre. Seems about appropriate. So if we go into the Tennessee Titans, the team that was unbeaten last season, you can see a slightly different approach to this. So they don't probably have anyone on Matt Cleveland's level. I would imagine the guy who's probably their best fit is probably Braxton Cave. Similar in terms of strength, blocking, he's probably got a little bit of a position deficit to Cleveland. But he's obviously paid a lot less, $2.7 million. So what does that tell me? It tells me that realistically, if I want Matt Cleveland, I want him to start, I'm not going to go and offer him $8 million. I'm probably going to offer him somewhere between the ballpark $5 to $2 and a bit million is probably what I would say. So that's just generally the thought process that I tend to go through when thinking about players is you look at that salary analysis. It gives you a little bit of an immediate snapshot without necessarily having to do any major amounts of data lifting and things like that. And then have a little look at other players and seeing what their rough demands are. The other thing I tend to do is I go into the latest transactions and I just have a little look to see what type of similar players have signed for. You can see Mangold there was paid $10 million. He's obviously far better than Cleveland. If we scroll down, let's see if we can find a centre who's just signed recently. The other thing I should say with centres and guards, I tend to consider them together in terms of skill set. You can kind of play them equal proportion. So look, here's GERHART, who's signed for the Broncos. Probably similar in terms of capability to Cleveland, actually. And he was paid $4.5 for a couple of years. So, still validating the idea that we're probably going to want to bid for Cleveland if he's starting for us between, $2 and a bit million and probably $5 million would probably be my max. So that's how I would tend to sort of approach free agency for every position. And there may be some situations where you just go, okay, I just need to pay that amount of money and just get that guy in, and the money matches to what some of that logic that we've just talked through. I mean, I would say in particular, elite kickers tend to be similar sort of ballpark values, and their actual salary seems to kind of more or less correspond. I mean, $1 million and a bit for a kicker is not an outrageous amount of money. So, there are some positions where you might just look at it and go, yeah, actually that's more or less fair value for what I need. And obviously, take those different factors in consideration and really think it through that way. And because the easiest way you can kill your franchise, in my opinion, in our league, is if you go in and you bid huge amounts of money to a small select number of players and then realise you are cap constrained for 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And we've seen it time and time again that has been a massive situation for a range of teams, really. And hopefully this just gives you a couple of different tips and ideas of how you can just try and get your head around thinking about bidding for free agents and what factors you can kind of take into account to come to the best conclusion of that. And for those of you who are completely new and maybe don't necessarily have to bid on free agents for this year, go and have a look at the free agents, the list of transactions that have been completed, and just see what sort of money is being thrown around for what type of guys. Because there's obviously some teams that are obviously veterans that have been around for a long time, got a good idea and a good handle on what is roughly an adequate value for a position or for a type of player. And you'll quickly get a sense just from scanning this list and just looking through it, what you feel is an overpay, what you feel is an underpay, and what you feel is probably fair value. And you can use that to sort of help base, not this year, but also next year's free agency as well. So I hope that gives it just a couple of tips and a couple of ideas going forward. And of course, if you have any questions or anything, talk in the chat, because most people on the server are happy to talk about different types of prices for players, talk about what's an underpay, overpay. It's one of the main discussion points during free agency usually. So, get that chat going as well. It also helps in understanding and learning of how free agency works. But now it is time for us to delve into the final part of our show, which is the CSFL GM Bites. And of course, we've got to announce who the GM was from last week's episode. But before we do that, let's recap and hear the audio from it and see if you guys can try and have a final guess.
You are listening to the GM Bite on the CSFL Kickoff Show.
So, did you guys guess it? It was none other than our very own admin, Dylan, the San Francisco 49ers GM. Interested to know whether you got it. Put it in the server, put it in the chat here. But thank you very much, Dylan, for joining and pulling in the audio for us. But it is time for this week's CSFL GM Soundbites. Let's hear from the GM.
You are listening to the GM Bite on the CSFL Kickoff Show.
Okay, there we go. Our CSFL GM Bite is in. Get your guesses into the Discord server or on the chat here. Interested to know who you think it is for this week. But that brings us to a close for this week's episode. Thank you very much for Toasty and Palm for joining into the discussions for JJ Watt. And I'm sure we'll be back next time with probably another blockbuster and no doubt some chaos to happen before the end of free agency as we turn our eye towards pre-season